So welcome to the second lecture of our series, How to Become an Architect. So over the coming months we'll be joined by young architectural and spatial practitioners who will shed a light on the path beyond the cap and gown. And we will set out to unveil the transition from education to architectural practice and explore the journeys of establishing their own practices and discovering their own unique creative voices. Today we have the privilege to present to you Enzo Valerio. Enzo studied architecture in Delft and at the ETH in Zurich, and he started his own practice in 2016 in Rotterdam. And in his work he pushes the classic notions of what an architect is, and he blends the boundaries of design through a strong commitment to self-build and on-site testing and experimentation. Yesterday I saw a story on his Instagram where he was testing a mock-up of a bathtub made out of foam, which was modeled after a smaller model. He won't be showing it today, unfortunately, but it's super cool. Check it out. He's very hardcore in this sense. There's really many things I can say about his unique way of working, but instead I'll just give up the floor to Enzo Valerio.
Thank you. Is my voice loud enough to just talk like this? Yeah, because I prefer without a microphone. Just let me know when it's not loud enough, then I'll jump back on the microphone. All right, I'll tell today a bit about my my practice. I'll start off with my education and kind of how I grew into architecture. And then I'll talk about two different projects, one which we are finishing right now, and another project which I've been working on from 2017 until 2020. All right. I started my bachelor studies in Delft, at the TU Delft. And at the end of my bachelor studies, I started working on the construction site 3 days a week next to my bachelor end project. I was working with a renovation company and did mostly carpenter work. Having difficulties with the approach of the TU Delft at the time, I was searching for an approach in architecture where the physical work would play a more important part. The idea of drawing something and fine-tuning it while building appealed to me for the first time in this period. This was the time that the Y Factory and Hyperbody were the cool thing at the TU Delft. And I did not see any correlation with the idea that I had about architecture with the professors and the direction of those chairs. As I find very little enthusiasm for the approach of the TU Delft, I decided to see if I could do my master studies at the ETH in Zurich. I've been visiting Switzerland since I was a young kid. Because my grandparents they live in Graubünden in Goor, near close to Goor, actually across from the village Haldestein where Zumthor's office is. As I became more interested in architecture, I found out that many of the buildings and many of the architects that I was actually interested in came from Switzerland or actually were practicing in Switzerland, and many of the buildings that I found inspiring actually were very close to my grandparents' place. So after my bachelor studies, when I had an interview at Zumthor's office for an internship, my grandmother actually dropped me off with the car in front of his office, which was just like a 5-minute drive away from where I always visited her in my youth. In the Swiss architecture scene, I think there is a general approach in architecture, but also an appreciation of craftsmanship, which was really lacking in the time that I was studying in Delft. So when people now ask me where I come from, I always tell them that I'm a Dutch-Swiss architect, and that's not because I'm native Swiss, or my Swiss German is fairly excellent, but it's because I did my studies at ETH, and I think that really shaped me to the designer that I currently am. Now that I'm hiring a lot of people, I actually notice this more often. The school that you go to really forms the way, at least how you start in your professional practice. So the references and everything that I do in my methodology kind of came from my education, I would say. After graduating from the ETH, I started working at Art Foundry, which is a company that produces big sculptures for the big known names around the world. So they started off with bronze casting, but the company kind of developed over the years into a company that does, well, basically any kind of sculpture, any kind of technique that you can imagine, and develops those techniques together with the artist, often in-house. So what happens at the foundry is that artists, they come over, they stay in the residency, or they stay in the city of St. Gallen, which is close to the foundry, and they spend a significant time there. It could be weeks, but sometimes even they spend months there. And then together with the people at the foundry, the first idea, the first sketches are kind of developed into a sculpture that is then really produced also there. So the idea and the concept of making a sketch and kind of having a creative process, which doesn't only include the ideas and the models and the mock-ups, but actually the physical object, the end product, as part of that process, is something that I saw there, and it really inspired me to take to architecture. On the pictures behind me, you see on the left side, you see the workshop. This is actually where the bronze casting is taking place, and on the right side, you see the artist library, which is just outside of the workshop. You see kind of how, well, the two things kind of come together, where people work with their laptops, and then 3 steps away, you're in a big workshop, and the things that you're drawing and that you're sketching on your laptop, you can actually try in a one-to-one. This is a project one I worked on in my time being there for Fischli-Weiss, which is kind of nice because it was standing outside of the Guggenheim, which was one of my absolute favorites as a young kid. Now I'll jump back a little bit and tell you a bit about my my graduation project, which is the last thing I did as a student. So my graduation project was about the Ziel, which is a river floating through Zurich. Zurich is basically built in a delta of 2 rivers. One is the Limmat and one is the Ziel. The Limmat comes from the lake Zurich and then flows through the city towards the Rhine. And the Ziel comes from a mountain region close to Zurich and then flows through the city and goes to the Rhine as well. The Limmat is water is heated up in the lake. It's very, very crystal clear. It's kind of the pictures you see from Switzerland with the blue water. This is kind of what it looks like. And in summer, the water is a really nice temperature to swim in. So historically, the city has been built around the shores of the Limmat. Almost every 100 meters, there's a different bathing opportunity, and everyone really loves that river. But there's another river in the city, which is the Ziel, which is most of the time only 20 or 30 centimeters deep. But then with heavy rains, the water might actually come up to 2 or even 3 meters height. This happens, as you can see in the graph on the left. This is what happens every 10 years, and every 100 years the water is actually like almost to the shores of the riverbed. The river delta has been designed for these extreme situations with extremely high water. And although Zurich is one of the cities in the world with the most expensive square meters, there is this big riverbed that goes to the heart of the city through the most expensive parts. Actually, on the right side here, you see the main station. It goes underneath the main station, and this part is just left. There's just grass growing there, nothing happens there. There's no program. So what the design was that I did was actually figuring out a way to use the riverbed in, let's say, the 99 out of 100 days that the water is low, in a way that it actually adds square meters to the program of the city, but at the same time, when the water would be high, that there wouldn't be a big risk of infrastructure actually getting ruined. So basically what I ended up doing is designing a series of staircases that connect the layer of the city to the layer of the river, kind of bridging those, depending on the location in the city, bridging those 5 meters to 3 meters height difference, and allowing people to actually walk into the riverbed. As you can see on the rendering of this project, if the water would get high and would overflow, nothing would be demolished. So the entire design was basically made as a super robust infrastructure that just would allow people to use it on days where the water would be low. It's another situation with where they started building a highway in the 60s over the center of Zurich. They figured that the rivers were still not built on, so they actually started building infrastructure, which was called Project Y, over both the rivers, a huge highway. And then after 1 kilometer, there was so much protest that they stopped, which is actually the section you see on this picture is just like a clean cut where they stopped building the highway. But you see kind of the river is this weird abandoned space in this super highly occupied city. And I think the staircases kind of made the transition from that city landscape to this oasis of silence just underneath the city. Yeah, some details of how the staircase were put together. I think what I did for the first time in this project, which really is something I still try to do to this day, but maybe a bit on a different scale, is then the idea of taking something from a, let's say, bigger scale. So in the case now in my project, most of the time which would be a concept or more like a historical context that you're building the project in, and spending a significant time on actually analyzing what the context is, what the place is you're building in, and then working all the way to the smallest detail and trying to make that bridge that gap as soon as possible within your process, so that the details actually can inform the way that you treat, let's say, in this case, a cityscape. After a year working at the foundry, I got an offer to do a job in the Netherlands, which was the reason I moved back to the Netherlands, and I started my own office. As it goes with most of these projects, the project died after 3 months and the invoices were never paid. I was together with a partner, and we had fierce discussions over how to run our office. And I started already, had this strong feeling I wanted to do something more in the direction of execution, where actually the execution would be part of the office, and he saw that as inspiring but not something for him. So we decided to both go our own ways. And basically in 2017, when I started my office just by myself, the first project that I could actually execute in the way that I really wanted to was Playtime, which this is a model picture of. Playtime is an old post office in the center of Rotterdam that was vacant for a few years. And I found a way to basically buy the place, finance it, and then refurbish it, and then rent it out. And I had difficulties in explaining to clients why it was so essential for me to not only do the design, but also the execution. So I figured the only way to kind of prove to these future clients that this works is doing a project for myself and actually showing them that this is, it's possible to do, and the result that you get is something that, I want to stand behind. So, still in the process of figuring out a way to finance it and getting a loan, I was actually living in Amsterdam in a shared studio, and we basically started directly with building a huge model of the building, a 1:50 model. It's 1,000 square meters, so as you see, it's pretty big. And we started to use that model as a way of designing the interior. The building itself is kind of this modernist concrete structure with mushroom columns and in situ concrete floor slabs. And as you see in the floor plan, a lot of these buildings in Rotterdam, they're built after the Second World War. So you come up with this kind of perfect square idea with this grid, but most of the plots are actually not perfectly square. So you get this perfect grid, which is really not so perfect with all these weird angles in it. So and you see that in everything in the building. So it's like the columns are not aligned with the windows. The installations are put in after the concrete was done. So there's weird holes everywhere where they put the surfaces in. But then over this layer of concrete, there were basically 60 years of people renovating and changing the building, putting a ceiling under a ceiling, under another ceiling, and different installations with different fuse boxes on the same floor. So the starting point was to take all of that additions out and basically strip everything down just to the concrete structure and the concrete base of the building. On these floor plans, you see the ground floor and the basement. Quite untypical for Dutch buildings. There was a huge basement, 2.8 meter high ceilings in the basement, a really big concrete space. And the former owners of the building, they had a small car and actually parked the car in the basement. So there was a car elevator that takes your car from the street to the -1 floor where you can actually drive into your parking spot. I have a Volkswagen Polo, which is not a really big car, but my car doesn't fit on the car elevator, so it's really made for tiny Italian cars. But this allowed me to actually do a workshop in the basement where, for example, 6 meter long steel profiles and wooden panels and bigger elements would be possible to actually move down to the basement and move them into the workshop. And coming from the foundry, the initial idea was actually to do a building which was surrounding a communal workshop. So the idea was to do a big workshop and then do studios around it. The location of the building and the layout of the building didn't really align with that program. So the program was changed during the design process into a workshop which is actually only 50 square meters, has a small wood and a small metal spot. And then actually much bigger office spaces for people to work in. Now the office is shared with 30 people, and I think about 10 people regularly use the workshop, and mostly they do model building or mock-ups. There's a few people from the design academy here in Eindhoven, and they do furniture, but like smaller stuff. On the ground floor, you see there's these 2 halls with stairwells. So the idea was actually to do from the ground floor, make a connection to the basement, and having the studios which have direct access to the street. So these doors actually go directly to the street. Give them also their own basement space. This is really something that I wanted to have. So this space is my own studio. And then the basement, I have a workshop for model making just directly underneath my studio, and then the shared workshop for the rougher work. As you can see on these drawings, I think the holes were initially to be circular. These are actually the only cuts we did in the concrete. So other than this, everything was added on top of the concrete. These are actually the only addition we did to, or a change we did to the main structure. And we tried to rent a bandsaw, which is actually 2 wheels with a diamond thread in the middle, and then you put it on a big steel beam, and you can rotate it around, and you can cut like a perfectly circular hole. That was the idea. But as you see in the picture here, there's these mushroom columns, and they wouldn't allow us to actually place this device on the floor. So we ended up going for the cowboy version, which was basically this hole saw and just drilling a ton of hole saw holes. Initially we did 20 because the minimum we needed to make the circle was actually 20. So you see the piece that we cut out was a bit tricky because the piece actually was 300 kilograms and the maximum floor load on the floor was 150 kilograms a square meter. So we put these bigger beams underneath. But then I also figured, if there would be a construction company doing this, they probably wouldn't even think about this and just kind of wheel it out, which we ended up doing as well, and everything went okay. So we ended up with this hole, and actually liked it so much that we decided to kind of not go for the circular hole, but keep the cut the way it was. The points were really, really big, so we decided to drill another 20 holes to kind of make the points that stick out a bit smaller. As you can see now, the image on the left and the right. So the staircase we already ordered, so we kind of had to rebend the handrail to fit this hole, which was 5 centimeters smaller than the initial one. So this is floor plans of the ground of the first floor and the second floor. So on the first floor, you actually see, let's say, the heart of the building. This was also where the model image before was from. It's a shared space for 16 desks, a shared kitchen, a terrace, a meeting room, and then 2 rentable studios that go as a unit. And the idea was really to kind of make a space which would be institutional in the sense that people don't have the feeling, that they are. It should be a bit like a school or like a library. So people can bring their own stuff. It can be very messy, but still the building has the kind of this backtone that it becomes very like a neutral and simple space. So also the furniture, we did all these built-in tables with lights built into the tables as well, really big bookshelves on the sides. So the idea was that, you would have the feeling that you're, maybe back at university or in a communal space which was not owned by anyone, basically. Here you can see some images how we started demolition, taking multiple layers of ceilings away and basically breaking out all the walls that were still in there. They built a weird library in there with round walls and rugs on the floor and on the walls, quite wild. But we basically took all that out. And then actually you see on the right picture, often when we would take drywalls away, we would find the original tiles from the 60s behind the drywalls. And then in the basement, we found a space behind the drywall, which actually had storage of boxes of these tiles, which we ended up using in tiling all the bathrooms and toilets with. So on the first floor, we kind of moved around. My girlfriend and I, we moved into the building the day that we got the key. So we canceled our lease in Amsterdam and we lived on the second floor. Then we refurbished the second floor. We went to the ground floor. So we kind of moved everything around constantly. And to save some costs, also, I brought some people from Switzerland that I knew. And to save some costs, I could pay them less salary and then could basically let them live in the building as well. So we were living with 5 people in the building while refurbishing it. And on the first floor, we built this metal workshop. And all the metal tools we bought, we eventually actually ended up putting in the workshop, which is now the shared workshop of the building. I learned in the foundry in Switzerland, I learned how to weld. Just in like after hours and weekends, I would spend mostly on figuring out metal work and welding work because all the tools and all the knowledge was basically there. So it felt really logical when we started this project, with all the metal windows, all the steel windows being already in there and the concrete, it felt really like a good choice to actually focus on metal architecture or like steel architecture. So we ended up actually designing all these interior doors and staircases. And basically the full atmosphere of the interior now is only defined by the concrete structure, the additions we did in steel, and then some services that I'll come back to later. On the left you see a model. This was still the idea of only doing a steel handrail and then doing this ridiculous concrete staircase with sections that run up to 0 millimeters. I don't know how we could have done that, but that was, we kind of built mock-ups and models, and here on the right side you see different options for steps that we basically just welded together and then tried out how stable they are. And here you see, so all the steel work. Typically when you do steel work, you go to a workshop, you order it, and it gets delivered to you prefabricated. It never fits, so you always end up with seams, especially in old buildings where everything's crooked, with seams with silicon, where you kind of have to join the two things. You try to paint over it. But because we basically had all the equipment in the building here, we just welded everything directly into the concrete structure, so we could actually do everything seamless. And took the tolerances, for example, in the glass facades. I don't know if you see that, you probably don't. But the windows, if the ceiling does this, the window profiles do that as well, and then the glass is placed in, and if you look on the right side, you see that it's only 5 millimeters in the frame, and on the right side it might be 15 millimeters in the frame, which really, you're not going to see it, but you do see that there's no seams, there's no, everything is like, it looks like it's been in there with the concrete from the very beginning. So, yeah, steel staircase. So on the second floor, we did these sliding doors. As you can remember maybe from the floor plan, this is the only moment in the full building that you actually can see from the party wall to party wall. So you see the width of the building as a full. And you get this enfilade with the different columns standing like in front of the facade. I really didn't want to have a door frame on the columns, so we did these steel big sliding doors that actually would touch directly to the column. But as you can see in the left picture here, there's this double height space. The people that owned the property before me, they cut out this entire floor, which is something my structural engineer said, well, apparently it works, but I wouldn't have recommended it. But what you do notice is by cutting out such a huge amount of concrete in a building like this, the full building torques, and so there's no floor which is actually straight. You don't see it, but if you start to measure it, everything is warped and everything is a bit bent. So when we wanted to do these sliding doors that fit perfectly with these concrete columns, the column that is in this picture is on the top 2.5 centimeters more inward, and the other column is 2.5 centimeters more outward. So basically they stand like this. So what we did is we just measure with a laser line and then measure every 5 centimeters what the column does, and then just laser cut exactly that profile into the door. There's of course not a picture here where the door is closed, so you don't see how perfect the seam is, but I can tell you it's pretty okay. So and here you see on the left side this enfilade, how you see kind of along the columns. So initially, as you could see maybe in the first model that we did, 1 to 50, services are not typically something you do in your model building. So like water pipes and electricity circuiting, you don't really model that. So initially the idea was we just leave everything in the way it is. But at the point that we started like ripping everything out, we found out that the installations and the services were so bad that we kind of had to change it. So the idea came to actually use this as an addition to the architectural language of the building, and kind of use it as jewelry to this like very simple concrete white box, and then kind of use the plumbing and the electricity as almost as jewelry to it. So we actually bought at a plumbing shop, we bought this pipe bender. It's like a €20 tool. Which defines a certain radius to bend, and as you can see, the pipes on the floor, all the pipes are always 15 millimeters, and always they have the same bend radius. We try to minimize the amount of pipes, meaning that sometimes a pipe would have up to 6 different bends, which becomes quite complex when you do it three-dimensional, when it has to fit and be watertight. But it became this kind of language for the building, where I don't know if you can see it really well on this picture, but there's moments where you need to come around the corner, and then in the back here, so you need to figure out how you can work with these bends without the pipes like overlapping each other and it feeling like it's logical, and it looks very logical now, but like the three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle of that was quite something. Yeah, and as you see, I mean, basically everything is inside. Everything you see, where the water comes from, where it goes to. And then in the basement we put air pressure and 400 volts power in. So also there, you know, all the pipes, all the ducts are basically adding to this white architecture. Same thing for the curtains. There was an idea of adding something soft because everything was hard and like rough. So the idea was actually to add this soft layer of curtains. But since we wanted to let them run always from column to column, we needed to find a detail to kind of treat those mushroom columns. So we made this aluminium rail, which actually standing on a little feet, for which we designed this little other rail we need to put on the back of the rail, so that it could actually be just hanging down at the height of the mushrooms. And here you see the workshop in the basement on the left side, and then on the right side the big space taken from the apartment. So I think program-wise, it's quite interesting that, you know, I'm living basically in an office, which, you know, changes the atmosphere in the office in the sense that everyone that is renting there, you know, it's important to me that these people align with my way of working. And many of them actually became good friends. So it's, you know, I'm really enjoying kind of having this mix of living and office. And at the same time also the fact that someone lives in a building makes it, you know, much safer for example, people breaking in on the weekends or after hours, because there's almost always someone there. So I finished this project in 2020. And in 2018, there was actually a call for a competition for a pavilion in the botanical garden of Hilversum. And I went to visit the location, and the location was amazing, and the project was very small, kind of almost this question for like a sculpture, like a pavilion without, you know, it needed to be a stage, but nothing more than that really. And I thought it would really fit well with my way of working. But I had a bit of doubts, because it's very difficult to do an open competition when you are not able to communicate up front that if you win the competition, you know, the design is not going to be done, and you actually want to do the execution to finish the design. So I was asked by the municipality of Rotterdam to do a competition as well, and then I communicated this, and they said, well, thank you very much, but, you know, we're not so interested in that, because we can basically not give you already the job for the execution when you win the competition. So with this pavilion, there was two pre-rounds, and then actually in the round, in the second round, there was an interview. And in this interview, I communicated very clearly with them that if I would win the competition, then I would also want to execute it. And they said, yeah, absolutely no problem, which made me realize they absolutely did not know what I meant. But but they were really, I mean, they were nice people, and they had a professional jury, which also not seemed to be very scared about it. So. And it's actually interesting because they invited 8 architects. There was a selection of 135. They invited 8, and of the other 8, one person was Florian Edenberg, who is in charge of SOIL, this new office of New York, where I actually did my internship. And I hadn't seen him for many years, but then we suddenly needed to pitch for the same pavilion in this botanical garden where we met each other. And then he asked me if I wanted to have dinner with him afterwards. And then during dinner, I explained to him how my practice had developed into something where I really try to take this building part into the design. And he said, yeah, that sounds really romantic, but, you know, you're never going to win a competition with this, you know, forget it. People don't want this. People want, you know, they want to understand what you do. They want to be safe, and they don't want to experiment. So, yeah, it was a nice dinner. And then the day, I think a week later, I got an email from the Botanical Garden that they made like a selection of 4 from the 8, and Zoe was out, and we were still in. So it was was nice. So we handed in this. This is actually the model that we handed in for the competition. So the idea was to do a building which was almost like a monolith in this garden. It's a botanical garden focusing on pine trees. So it's called a pinnatum, which basically they only do what is it called? Firs and pine trees. And it's located in Hilversum, which kind of has this very typical soil. It's a part, the last part of the Hollandse of Utrechtse Heuvelrug, which is a moraine created in the small ice time. So where most of the Dutch ground, at least not here, but where I come from, in Leiden and in Amsterdam, is peat and mud and dirt. This is kind of the first moment that you start to see a lot of sand in the ground, and that sand has this amazing yellow color to it. So they're actually doing a lot of digging work around Hilversum because they were moving a exit for a highway, and there you could really see this section of the the geology hobby organization of het Gooi, that basically send pictures to each other of all the building pits, and if someone makes a basement, they go there and then they take pictures. So the idea was actually to use that sand as part of the design. So instead of kind of going for, let's say, the obvious choice of doing a wooden structure in a garden, which is all about wood and timber, to take something which offsets a bit from the trees, but feels like it belongs to it, And then the idea was the soil, it's basically what feeds all the trees. So taking that element and then putting it in between the trees felt like something which is not such a strange thing and actually still fits really well with the location. And then only when much later in the process, I found out how people are obsessed with their soil in Hilversum, and they'll collect the stones that they get out of there's all these moraine stones that came from Iceland, from Finland and from Sweden in this ice time, and then they analyze them. So everyone has stones in their garden in Hilversum. The design was basically three concrete walls with a concrete roof and a concrete floor. And you can imagine that people, like volunteers working for a botanical garden, were not super enthusiastic about doing a concrete monolith in their garden. And then with this very abstract white model, which was only about composition and about the way that these concrete elements would sit in between the trees, they were not super enthusiastic. But luckily there was a professional jury which actually was very enthusiastic about the design, and they convinced the botanical garden that they should really go for this design because there was great potential in it. So when this was in 2018, so the beginning of 2019 was actually the moment that I had the first talk with the people of the botanical garden, and they still had them in their minds, this white model that had been standing in their visitor center since I won the competition in summer. And basically they were all preparing to tell me that this was absolutely not going to happen, and that I should not be disappointed, but they would find someone else to do the building. So I came in the room, and it's like a volunteer thing, so it's evening, like a January evening, and everyone was sitting there with tea with their arms crossed, basically waiting me to do a presentation and tell me that this is not going to happen. So I prepared these renderings for this, the one you see here on the side, and these drawings in which really kind of the trees surrounding the building play the lead role in the drawing, and the building becomes this thing which is actually set between the trees. And I think this atmosphere really appealed to me much more than this abstract white model. But obviously, in this image, you already see that the textures of the concrete, they kind of they're everything. So it's this composition, but then figuring out how to make the walls look like they do actually in the renderings, which was taken from a ruin somewhere in Spain, obviously not something we could do one-to-one, would be kind of the the big question in how to get the building as good as it was, as the images. So they were more convinced than they were in the beginning, but it took like until 2020, I think, to really convince them that this was the direction they should go for. So we went on this, we did the model, 1:50 model of concrete, where we tried to, mimic as well as we could these different treatments of concrete. We had the idea of mixing in sand from the garden, which has this very vivid yellow color, so the concrete gets a bit warmer. And if you tell, anyone, let's say, of the Plattenbau generation, that concrete will become a bit warmer and a bit less cold, then, they start to like it already a bit more. So we did this model also with green trees and not with yellow trees. So it's also, I said, now I can understand the gardener much more, because the gardener, the first thing he said, these trees will never be yellow. I said, yes, I understand. But yeah, it's actually nice. The gardener, he lives in the garden, so we're basically building in his backyard, which, he needed to be really, really closely, we needed to have really close communication with him. He hated the project in the beginning, we'll come to it later, but he's a big fan now, and he's going to be the one that's going to broom the floor, so, you need him on board. So we did this 1:50 model, and then we took them on a trip to Germany to see the Bruder Klaus Kapelle, which of course is amazing concrete. And then a stonemason that I knew from Switzerland, who now has a workshop in Cologne, that also explained how concrete can be almost like a natural stone. So you see here the team with the client at the workshop. So, and then we started working in samples. I think this was still 2020, I think. So we did a bunch of these samples, which we tried to hammer treat, and it was really, really difficult to see what this result would be on bigger scale. And already these blocks, it's concrete, so these are like 40 kilograms. So, if you don't want to fill your full studio with these blocks when you still don't know the project's actually going to take place. So, but with the images and with the drawings and with the mock-ups, they decided they want to go for it, and they started fundraising, which took until the end of 2022. So about a year ago, I got a phone call from them that they got all the money. And then we applied for the permit, which was also still exciting because the garden is actually heritage. So building in the middle of the garden was not such a simple thing to do. But the municipality was super enthusiastic actually about the design. And then one of the things which was interesting was I told them the composition as it is now in the design, I'm not 100% sure that this will actually be the thing that we will be building, because we might set it out and then decide that it's better if we move a wall 50 centimeters here or make the roof a bit smaller or bigger there. So what is the protocol? Is this possible? And then I said, well, as long as the principal idea, and we will write that down for you, and it's basically 3 walls oriented in a certain way with a floor, and if that stays the same, then we can agree on additions or changes in the design, as long as the structural engineer agrees. So basically, and that's also what they actually wrote in the advice for the permit, which was very surprising to me. But it gave us the possibility to actually set out the building in January, and then make the final decisions on how we actually wanted to make it only when we actually saw the composition there. So here you see the building staked out on the right side. So we did the entire building with these wooden battens, and then basically overlaid the renderings over the actual stakeout, so we could see the way that these elements would actually sit in between the plants, and also walk around it and really kind of experience and feel. Another thing we did was actually dig out the roots to see, because the idea was that the building would be built around the existing trees. So if we would cut the root and the tree would die, the whole concept would be a bit not so great. So we dug out all the roots and actually had to change the foundation design as well, which we did then with the gardener, of course. So and then the big moment came where we actually started digging in the garden. So we dug out this big, deep pit to get for the foundation, and all the sand that we took out for the foundation, we used for a concrete mix. We had been working with a concrete factory for another project, and they're a very small factory, about half an hour away from Hilversum, and they're the kind of people that you can basically go to and say, well, I'm going to dig out this 100 cubic meters of sand. Could you mix it into concrete and then tell me if the concrete is good enough to use for a 2.5 meter cantilevering roof? And they did, and then we took out the sand and we transported it to them, and they basically we made some samples with them, and then we started working on mock-ups in the garden. So the mock-up you see on this picture is actually the third mock-up we did in the garden. The first one was just with hammer treatment, which was not as convincing as we hoped, because you saw a lot of cement in the surface, and basically the idea was that we would put bigger stones in the concrete as well that would come out when we would hammer treat the wall, as basically you saw in the renderings right here. So we tested actually by not only placing stones in the concrete while casting, but also placing sand in there. We could get these cracks that you see here in the mock-up, and then by by air blasting the sand out, you basically get these cavities that make these darker lines in the concrete, and they still have a bit of the yellow of the sand to them, and then the stones can be placed in those. So the mock-up, as you see it on the left side, ended up in being the direction we wanted to go for, which meant that we basically had to adapt the full structural principle, because the rebar in a concrete wall is typically very close to the surface. But to be able to actually put these big stones in and the sand in, we needed more space. So we actually moved the rebar 15 centimeters to the back, so people could put their hands in and put these sand cracks in and put stones in without actually the concrete being structurally unsafe. Then another thing was we wanted to do wooden battens from the bottom to the top, but with this technique we needed to be able to reach the inside of the concrete. So we ended up working in 6 shifts of 4 hours, where we would cast, and then like during the cast actually we would stand around as you see here, stand around the formwork, and then one person would be sitting on top of the formwork basically saying, okay, a bit of sand there, one stone there, one stone over there, and then a bit of concrete, and then basically like arranging and orchestrating the cracks that would be appearing when we would take the formwork off in floor plan. But of course the weird thing is you don't really see it as an elevation, so it's kind of an abstract exercise in figuring out how much sand you need to put in for it to look good when the formwork comes off, which of course was a very big surprise. And the clients were by this point are so enthusiastic that they organized a big lunch, so they could actually sit there and have lunch while we were casting concrete. And here you see on the right side, you actually see me probably sitting there on the top, and then telling people where to put stones and where to put sand. Yeah, and here you see this is Harm. This is the guy we pump concrete with, and he's a great guy, but half the time he doesn't really understand why we take so much effort in getting the concrete in, because he says, yeah, you can do it twice as fast, I said, yeah, no, but this is okay. And this is the moment we took the first formwork off, so you actually see that the sand is still trapped in all the cavities. And then, so this is the first views of the done walls, and then basically with air pressure we started to blast out all the sand out of these cracks, and you get the walls as they are on the right side. And you see, the idea was really that the walls would feel like they would kind of grow out of the ground. You already see now they're getting patinated already now with standing in the garden. And these rough lower parts, the hope is actually that ferns will maybe at some point grow from it. The gardener says maybe they will. So the idea is that, the walls should look like they've been standing there for forever, basically. So The second element we made was the floor. Typically you do the floor before the walls, but because we wanted to have the walls standing in between the floor and have the feeling that the floor kind of floats out in these 3 different directions between the walls, we decided to cast the floor after the wall, so actually the floor would flow into the cracks as well, and then you basically feel much more the fluidity of the floor. We wanted to do a terrazzo floor, like highly polished, again, it's the same as in the rendering, that would kind of reflect the green of the tree surrounding. But we also wanted to put the significant size stones that you find in the garden. We actually wanted to put them into the concrete as well. So what we did, we actually built these concrete, small concrete boxes. We put all the stones in and casted them in concrete. Then took a big like stone cutter and sliced them into these kind of slices that you see here, and then break the concrete off again so that you are able then to take these slices and then put them actually into the cement when it's drying, so that when you polish it you get the effect of basically what you see here in the mock-up, that you see these really big stones in the floor. So the last thing we've been making, and actually we casted the concrete I think 2 weeks ago, so the formwork will come off in 2 weeks, was the roof. And the roof we wanted to make again this kind of reflective surface that would abstract and be like a big offset from what the walls are. So here, by the way, you can see nicely what the section of the wall is. It's pretty seriously dimensioned. So the idea was actually to do a seamless roof, which is not something you typically do in concrete, especially not in situ concrete. So what we did, we built a wooden floor, and then on the wooden floor we took the seams. We basically filled up the seams with polyfiller, what you would do for a furniture piece, and then primered the floor, sanded it again, and then lacquered it twice. So we basically ended up with a super abstract white kind of reflective surface, which was terrible to keep clean with the weather the last few months. So we built this big tent around it. It's really so here you see it's looked amazing before the concrete went in. We will see on the beginning of December if the concrete also will look amazing. And then we casted it 2 weeks ago, and now we're basically waiting for the formwork to come off on the 30th of November, and then on the 1st of December we'll see if the building looks the way we were planning on. But I think what is one of the amazing things to notice now, because the first project I did this way was for myself, so it was very different and it was very contained because it was in a building, no people from outside. And now that we're doing this in a public garden, where people actually, there's a lot of volunteers working there. There's a lot of people involved. There are a lot of people that have a specific emotion with this garden. There are a lot of people that really see it as their own back garden. And by spending so much time on the construction side and really developing the architecture while you are building it, not only do I strongly believe that the architecture ends up in being something where I don't think we could have done this in any other way, honestly, but also you see that you really take the client on a path in showing them the way that you actually make the architecture. I think the client knows quite well how to cast concrete now because we've talked so much about it. And, it was not only abstract, standing as an outsider and then telling the building company to cast it and make it cheaper and do it faster. But we're constantly talking about the quality and about, the way to make things work the way that we want to. And I think it's very valuable to see that is really appreciated by clients. These people had nothing to do with architecture before this project. But they are all, not only the direct client, but also other people in the garden. The neighbors, they come on the bicycle on the day that we have a big cast because they want to see if we succeed. So it's really nice how through a period of 6 months you can place a building in a community where it becomes more than just a building, but actually becomes something which is also part of the community, and where people have already give it a good start and have a big heart for it by the time that you finish the building. So that's it. Yes, if anyone has any questions, just let me know. Happy to answer anything.
What about the bath form?
Sorry?
What about the bath form?
The bath. Yeah, that's for a house. I wanted to put it in the presentation as well, but it was just a bit too much. So we're doing a private residency we've been working on since 2019, so already for 4 years. It started off with like a small design, but now it's like 5 buildings it's quite big, and there we are doing the cores. So it's in the swamp, so we needed to do concrete foundations. So even without doing any concrete architecture, we still needed to put 100 cubic meters of concrete on the plot just to be able to build the footprint we wanted to. So we decided to basically use the concrete also for the interior, and then place wooden boxes over it. So all the bathrooms are on the interior of the buildings, and we are basically doing all the sinks and all the bathtubs also out of the same in situ concrete. So so yesterday actually the mock-up for that bath came because the client wanted to test it, because he said, yeah, it sounds really great, but you know, I don't want to spend a lot of money on having a very chic bath that's like terrible to lay in. So we decided to, we worked in this model and then tried it out like with these wooden dolls, which is, you don't really see if it's comfortable. And then made a 3D scan and blew it up, and then now milled it out of foam. And we tried it out yesterday for the first time, and it feels very comfortable. So I think the next step will be to make an offset of that foam, then put rebar in, and we put heating pipes in it so that you don't lose the heat of the water when it's poured in the concrete. And then the idea is that there actually will be a floor of the bathroom which will go into the bath. So it will be polished in one piece. But again, I mean, these things are not really possible to do in any other way, I think. I mean, I didn't find a construction company that, you know, and also this, you know, we didn't come up with this idea before we started pouring the concrete and started testing out, you know, some polishing experiments. So, but yeah, it will be published online somewhere in the coming months for sure.
I have a question about the process of the floor slab. You first cast the green stones in a concrete slab and cut them, then took them out again and put them in again. Why did you pour them in first and then cut them?
Well, a very simple reason. If you have a stone like this, and most of these stones are granite, which is really, really tough. So, and if you want to cut that, you know, you can take an angle grinder and try to cut, but it doesn't work. So you can take a diamond saw where you can put it on a table and then pull the diamond saw over. But the stone is round. So as soon as you hit the stone, it will turn and shoot out, so you need to clamp it in a way. And clamping a round object is very difficult. So we figured the easiest way to do it is actually cast it into something. So you get a nice block, and then we can cut slices of that. So, and that worked out pretty well. Yeah, there's a lot of these things that you don't really think about it until you have the stone and you have to cut it, and then you think, oh yeah, so how are we going to do this? So that's the reason that ended up working that way. Yeah.
I have a question about your own studio.
Yeah.
You said you had a lot of troubles financing the project.
Yeah.
How did you in the end finance it?
With a loan.
Okay.
Yeah, and then a way of splitting it half into my own place with a loan, and then an office place with a loan, and then having to rent it out basically, and having signed rental contracts, and yeah, the whole thing.
Fully occupied.
Sorry?
Is it now fully occupied?
Yeah. So the last place on the ground floor, we have a coffee place. We finished the building in 2020, which was a difficult moment to open a coffee place in the Netherlands. So that stayed vacant until a bit more than a year ago, actually. And that was the last place to. And that took about a year for it to fully operate. So now it's we have a public space now in the building as well, which is really great. So.
How do you deal now with like the 2 persons that invited you to design their house in comparison to this building? How's the process with them? Because now you are dealing with 2 persons who want a place for their own.
Well, it's. I think it really. So I think in general, not even if you work, you know, any architect, the most important thing with the client, except that they have good taste, I would say, or that they trust you, is that, you know, they understand what you are doing, you know. So finding a client that can afford your building feels like very important when you just start your studio, but you find out pretty soon if it's someone that can afford less, but they understand what you're doing and what they are paying for, that's much more relevant. So I think that is also here, you know, they need to trust you, and they need to realize, you know, that what I'm doing now, we're really trying to do it for as little money as possible. So, for example, that project, I open everything, so I show them every cost that goes out, so they know exactly, you know, how much money I'm making. But I think the most important thing is that they just realize that, you know, what they're paying for is fair because you're doing something hyper experimental. And of course, the reality is, if you want to work in this way, it will be always taking more time and be more expensive. So the pavilion we did do with a fixed budget, and it looks like we're going to be just like 1% under budget. So, and I mean, we had a lot of open question marks there as well. So, but I guess maybe we were lucky there. I don't know. It's, but I mean, the reality is, if you want to do this and if you want to experiment, experiments can only be done when you accept that you don't know the outcome, which means there's a risk, and that risk can be either more expenses or more time. And most of the time, these two go together, because if something takes longer, it gets more expensive. So communicating that up front and not being like very optimistic about it and then saying, well, we'll do this for this much and it will, you know, never make it, that's very important. And of course, you have to communicate that not like from the get-go. You need to figure out a way to attract them first and then tell them, okay, well, this will be very expensive. So, but yeah, I mean, it's also, you know, it's also execution design. So by executing, you learn a lot. So there's some things that we can do rather efficient now. For example, we draw everything in 3D. So laser cutting, bending, you know, everything which is done with 3D models or 3D printing or milling are quite efficient because we have the 3D models anyway, right? Where typically you would send it to a construction company, they would have their own 3D modeler, which is extremely expensive, then makes a 3D model of your 3D model. I don't know why, but they always do, and then charge money for that, and then it goes to so, you know, then we cut that step by working directly from our own 3D model. So for the metal work, for example, we could actually work quite financially efficient. I mean, also the budget for that was not so high. But yeah, and of course, a big advantage, which you shouldn't underestimate, is when you do a design where you do the execution as well. Typically, let's say, you know, for a building of $1 million, you get 10%, well, in the Netherlands, maybe 6% as an architect, so you get 60,000 euros. And then for that 60,000 euros, you need to do the full design. And now we have 1,060,000 euros, of course, of which much of the money will go into material and to working hours. But all those working hours, you still are on site, working on the building, thinking about your design. So you have much more time to actually come up with details that are normally way too expensive, because, you know, you have to sit behind your desk and write down every hour. Whereas now you're carrying around the bag of concrete, and you can, while you're carrying it around, you can also think about, but why don't we do it this way? So it just makes your design process much less compact, and it smears it out over a much longer period, which I find very comforting. I've done 2 buildings without this method, and with both of them during execution, I thought that we should do it like this. It makes so much more sense. I mean, what are you going to do? Even if it's more efficient, they'll tell you it's more expensive and it will take more time. Because, I mean, that's the way that construction companies typically work. You know, they like good architecture, but they also need to make their money. And it makes sense, you know, it's not nothing against that, but yeah, the focus is just different. So.
Right, one more time.